Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this webinar hosted by UCL Centre for Educational Leadership. My name is Greg Ross. I'm based at UCL Centre for Educational Leadership, and I'm responsible for our global leadership development work. I'm really pleased to be chairing this webinar this evening. And this webinar launches Louise Stoll and Liz Robinson's think piece and research report, Transforming Leadership Learning, Designing for Sustainable Systemic Change. We've got a driving question behind the project, which I think will probably guide some of our thinking this evening, which is how might we better support and develop leaders for the complex and rapidly changing world in which they live. And I'm sure lots of you already will have read the think piece, so you'll know there are 7 key principles identified in the study, and we'll have the chance to think a bit more deeply together about those principles shortly. I'd like just to briefly introduce our speakers and panelists. Many of you will already know about Liz and Louise. Professor Louise Stoll is a Professor Emerita in our centre, the UCL Centre for Educational Leadership, and also an international education consultant. She is joined by Liz Robinson, who's co-founder and CEO of Big Education, which is a multi-academy trust and social enterprise focused on a holistic approach to learning, which includes the head, heart, and hand. And I know that's reflected in your approach to professional development and leadership development as well, Liz, and yours too, Louise. We're joined by 3 panelists as well. So we're going to start in a minute with some presentation from Liz and from Louise. And after that, we're going to have some responses from 3 panelists. Our 3 panelists are Valerie Hannon. Valerie's co-founder of both the Innovation Unit and the Global Education Leaders Partnership. Valerie brings deep understanding of how education systems currently work and is also a strong advocate for transformative change. Also, Evelyn Ford, MBE. Evelyn's a highly respected education leader, former president of the Association of School and College Leaders, and Evelyn's widely recognized for her work championing diversity and inclusion. She was awarded the TES Head Teacher of the Year in 2020. And a quick plug for you, Evelyn, her first book, Her Story, a Leadership Manifesto, was published last year. We were going to be joined by Professor Toby Greene, former director of our centre. Toby has unfortunately come down with COVID. He does have a message for you, Liz and Louise. He says, "I'm so sorry to miss this. It's an excellent and important report, especially at a time when we really need high quality leadership in education." So get well soon, Toby. And a big thank you to James Pope, who stepped in at the last minute to replace Toby on our panel. James is a former head teacher, an executive head teacher, and amongst other roles, James is director of Inspire Educate and the founder of Heads Up for Head Teachers, which is a network of school leaders. And he is someone who's going to bring a really valuable perspective, I think, both from a school leadership angle, but also someone who's been involved in driving system change for many years and working with school leaders at scale. So we'll hear from Liz and Louise, then we'll hear from our panelists. But as you listen, please do be noting down questions as they come up for you and reflections. And there'll be an opportunity in the last 30, 40 minutes of the webinar for you to put your questions to our panel and to Liz and Louise. And we're really looking forward to hearing lots of questions from you. I'm going to pass over to you, Liz, and I know you're going to just invite everyone attending the webinar to kind of check in briefly.
Thank you, Greg, and hello, everybody. It's wonderful to see, I can't see you, but know that lots of colleagues and wonderful people joining us today. I just wanted to invite us to take a moment to pause, because you probably, like the rest of us, have had a busy day and been doing all sorts of different things and had our brains across all sorts of different things. So practicing what we preach, rather than going straight into bombarding you with loads of information, we'd love to invite a bit of a moment of pause. You might even just want to close your eyes for a minute, or just not if you're driving, don't close your eyes, but just take a moment or lower your gaze, and really invite you to take a few deep breaths. I'm going to do that as well, and just so we're just peaceful for a minute as we just kind of tune in, give our bodies a chance to move into a different space, reflecting and learning, leaving, transitioning from whatever we've just been doing. So just a moment of peace to take a few deep breaths. Just noticing as you're checking in what's going on for you, where you're at, how you're checking in, if anything you need, if you need to go and grab a glass of water or run to the toilet, do whatever you need in order to be in a space where we're going to hopefully have a really stimulating and thought-provoking bit of time together. Great, thanks, Greg. Back to you.
So I think we're now passing on to Louise and to Liz, who are going to just take us through some highlights from your study, some questions to think about, and some provocations for the panel to respond to.
Okay, thank you. We have come together here, Liz and I, because we're both very passionate about leadership learning, and we have come to the conclusion in all of our work over the years that powerful leadership learning is fundamental to creating schools and educational environments that are thriving for children, young people, teachers, and for their communities indeed. And my focus on leadership and leadership development over the last 25 years has been really interesting as I have watched the changes around us in education. And I don't think there's ever been such a time when there have been really profound changes, global changes, if we move on, Liz, and in a coalescence, I would call it, a coalescence of crises, whether it's around climate, around social cohesion, around people living longer. So 50% of the children who were born in 2007 are expected to live to well over 100. That means, that's in many countries, and that means into the 22nd century. And also unresolved challenges of equity, inclusion, adolescent disengagement, and so on. And that has led internationally to moves in many countries to broaden curriculum, to assess a wider range of competences. If we look at the PISA 2022 assessment of critical thinking. And in line with that, we think there needs to be a rethink of leadership competencies, a broader range, and associated development. And so we posed ourselves some questions. You can see the 3 questions on the screen: whether our past approaches are adequate, significantly, if people, leaders, are designing for the future, leading for the future, are they stuck in the past, and is our evidence base suitable? And that was very uncomfortable for us. as leadership learning designers, both of us, evaluation for me and design, and leadership learning designer for Liz. And that challenged practical and evidence-informed thinking.
So the partnership between Lou and I is what gets referred to as a pracademic partnership, and that may be a term you've come across or not. But what does that really mean? The pracademic, the practitioner and the academic is this blend of academic rigor and practical experience. And for us, that's really critical because it is about this bridging. It is about evidence, rigorous evidence, which is so critical in informing decision making, but that can often seem disconnected. So this is about real, relevant, relatable and practical work. We want to do work that makes a difference. And I guess this really models what we'll come to when we look at the principles in Principle 6, which is this integration of practice with the research, and it's been a very fruitful way of working. So yes, we're pracademics, but we're also friends, curious friends, and that is a friendship that has developed. And again, we realised when we tried to fill in this slide, we don't take many selfies of ourselves together. And this is with brilliant Bernie from Malta as well there on the left. But what I really want to get across here is that it is the relational aspect, which is another one of the principles, Principle 3, which we model. This is about working together. I'd admired Louise as an academic, and we have developed through doing this work a really important friendship. And I want to just take a moment to acknowledge that Lou in particular has got some quite serious personal challenges in terms of health with her beloved partner, and the fact that we're here doing this work is testament to her commitment. And just to acknowledge that life happens for all of us, and that's part of the human part of this. We've been to each other's homes and spent many hours grappling with these ideas through a process of mutual support. So why have we done this? What are we aiming for? What are we trying to get out into the system? We just think it's so critical, and Lou referred to some of that in her introduction. And we want to share this. We want to make a difference. We have insights that can inform the way that professional development needs to go. We hope that will inform government thinking, and we are delighted to have had very strong engagement with the Department for Education already here in the UK. And overcoming some of the kind of commercial tensions of different providers. We're in a competitive system in England, and we want to overcome that and just put our knowledge that we've come to out into the system for the benefit of everybody. It's a good moment because the NPQs, the National Professional Qualifications in England, are under review. And so it feels a critical moment for us to really do something to address what we see as the kind of oversimplification of school leadership as it has been defined, and seeking to kind of put rigor and meat on the bones of some of the other things that we know matter about school leadership that are sort of missing from the mainstream of how leadership learning is developed in England at the moment. So it's part of a broader thinking about leadership, particularly when we think about some of the big trends in the system around place-based working, around kind of going beyond new public management approaches, all the sort of work around public service reform with an emphasis on co-production, an emphasis on test and learn methodologies, and a gaping hole really in what that means for our leaders and indeed for their leadership learning.
And so in relation to the methodology, over the last 15 years, I've been looking at and been really interested in leadership programs that are trying to focus on some of the challenges. And I've had the opportunity to evaluate several of these. And so I selected a purposeful sample of 5 programs, 4 of which I evaluated. I'll show you these programs shortly. I'll put a slide up, and that's all the information is in the think piece and the research report. But all of these are have been focused on systemic change, sometimes in line with national or provincial policy, but not always. And with deep change. But all of them, through this evaluation, have shown impact. They've shown impact in terms of on leaders themselves as they've participated. It's been transformative in terms of powerful shifts, patterns of thinking, reframing beliefs, deeper understanding of themselves, greater authenticity and confidence to be able to speak out and do what they want, self-efficacy, much more curiosity and increasing urgency for what they want to change and the need to have powerful impact for their children and young people. They've also changed the organizational culture with bold, innovative projects, tools, prototypes, modes of assessment, curriculum, ways relationships occur. And that is both through talking to them, finding out from them, but also speaking to other people and finding out from other people. And often wider impact, some of them wider impact because they've gone on to more positions with much greater, wider influence, but many of them getting involved in national, provincial initiatives, feeding things through to their networks. Thanks, Liz. And what we were trying to do in that is to look at the program's intent, their impacts and processes. And I asked Liz if she would work with me to look across these so that we could think about what it is that we could take forward. Before I look at that, I just want to talk about some of the complexities in this, a brief about evaluation, Liz. So the evaluations were very much iterative. We were not evaluating to someone else's external criteria. We were evaluating to their theories of change, their desired outcomes. And often when I was evaluating a program, I was evaluating a moving vehicle. And that meant that we had to move very much the approach, and it became much more evaluation for learning, as I would call it, evaluation for change, using evaluative thinking, whereby it was iterative and I was feeding things through as we were moving along. Thank you. And these are the 5 programs, 2 from England, 1 from Canada, 1 from Austria, and 1 from New Zealand. And a shout out to, I know that some of the people are with us on the call, so thank you very much on the webinar for joining us. The main thing to say about these, now I will stay with that, is that they're designed and facilitated by different combinations of policymakers, practitioners, researchers, etc. Some of them involve participating leaders from inside and outside schools and beyond. One is a health initiative, and we're not going to talk about the implications of that. Some are ongoing, some aren't. One is starting up again in New Zealand. At least the ideas from that are being moved into another program. And they've all been chosen for insights. Moving on, Liz. We also supplemented these with different insights from other international examples and initiatives that might not be described as leadership development, but are fundamentally important, and also emerging themes. So these are rapidly emerging themes. Some of them found their way into some of the programs. I'm not going to go through them, but they are all there for you in the paper. Just before we come to our findings, a quick word about language. And we note actually in England that there has been a move in Ofsted just recently to looking at the word learning rather than development. For us, I've been looking at language for a while. I wrote a paper in lockdown. And in the same way that professional learning needs to be ongoing, we think that that reflects a better picture. We say the same for transformative leadership, and leaders have to see themselves as learners. In this time of uncertainty, leadership is learning, leadership as learning. And also, another point about language is that it's more than thinking about a program. We use the word program, but we actually mean something much broader, something much more long-term, more multifaceted. And we also use the term associated activities because they are carefully orchestrated and multifaceted to connect different opportunities to ensure depth and breadth and length of learning.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lou. So that brings us on to the actual findings. And I invite you now, again, just to take a moment to pause. Quite a lot of information you've already had and a lot more to come. We've distilled this down into this visual and invite you, and I'll be quiet, to have a look at it and just take a moment to notice it. We're going to actually open up the chat function and be really curious. We're not going to promise to respond to all 150 comments, but be really curious to hear from you and give a chance for you to reflect and articulate. Just what do you notice? What does it bring up? What strikes you? And then we'll obviously have a chance to go through it. But wanted to give you a chance to just interact with it, absorb it for a second yourselves. I've just seen somebody go in the chat. That suggests it's working. Great. Thank you, Nick. Nice. Shout out from Big Education there. So no right and wrong answers, of course, but just a chance to notice what strikes you. Beautiful. And Lou and I were just reflecting before we were debating whether to open the chat function. We thought it might be a bit overwhelming, but we're so excited to read that. This is our first outing for it, so we will really cherish looking at and reading those comments, and we will save it and look at it in detail. So we obviously can't kind of absorb it and respond now, but thank you for taking the time. I can see they're piling in now, so we really do appreciate that and hope it gives you a chance just to feel your way in to the findings. So I'm going to make a start, but please, I'm sure you'll carry on adding those comments in. So here they are. These are the 7 principles. You kind of read them. They're there in the visual. And so the point here to say is that as Lou said, that those were the cases we looked at, as well as the other information, and pulled that together through this kind of analysis. And what we identified, we didn't start out looking for 7, was 7 really compelling principles which cut across them all. So we're going to, as you might imagine, whiz through looking at each of them. So the other thing to say is that they, which you may well have picked up from the visual, they are, of course, all interconnected. So whenever you're trying to pull out themes, it's not as neat as that. So we've tried to make them distinct, but as the visual suggests, they are connected to one another. So the first one, principle 1. This is really, often I talk about big education, our work as being about asking bigger questions and having better ways to get to better answers to those bigger questions. And that's really the sort of framing of this first principle. The programmes were unapologetically, as it says, pitched beyond the status quo of managing the current reality. It's about going beyond institutions and beyond our own timescales. So when we think about inter and trans institutional leadership in places, so what does that really mean? A real emphasis on the systemic. This is not about being able to think about school leadership in a silo. Young people are, of course, made up of many aspects, and schools are in places with multiple different aspects impacting on a child's ability to achieve and to thrive, if we were to use the government's language of the day. So going beyond individual KPIs as leaders, going beyond our own timescales of what we're going to be around to see the results of. How do we help people to reconceptualize what school is, ask the big questions, and this, of course, has profound implications for leadership. So interconnected with that, which one should come first, we can argue about. This has huge implications for what kind of leaders we need. What do we need leaders to be like, to be good at, and to know about, if they are to lead this process of learning our way into the future? Nobody has the answers globally. No jurisdiction has cracked the equity problem. It's an ongoing, complex problem that we're all working on. So we need to be seeing those qualities as identified there around kind of curiosity, humility, vulnerability, which underpinned by this equity driver, which was a significant factor in all the programmes, but this real sense of how do we work on the system as well as working on ourselves. And I suppose one point to say there about why this matters so much, 3 quick quotes. Tolstoy says, everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to change themselves. And so this confronting fact that, we are the system. The system isn't something out there. How we behave, what we do is the system. And therefore, as Gandhi said, you must be the change you want to see in the world. So this is a profound expression of that. And as Margaret Mead, of course, then famously said, never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So this sense of change and the sense of agency within that, and actually deep responsibility for one's own self within that. So these 2 principles, we love that graphic, hope you got that, might do it again in case anyone missed it, are foundational for the rest of the work, and that's why they're at the core, and they feed out into the rest of the work. So Louise is now going to take us through the next 4 parts.
Yes. Relationships, deep relationships, authentic relationships are really fundamental to system change, and really come through very strongly in this, looking across the piece. Hard, as we know, to form, easy to break, and therefore the real importance of that psychological safety, because this is deep, hard work for a whole group and in smaller groups. It requires openness and vulnerability and trust. And unless you have all of that, it's incredibly difficult to get into the sorts of challenging learning conversations that are important. No question that coaching comes through as really important, and in different ways. I mean, if I take an example from New Zealand, there are 3 different kinds of coaching that are used there in a range. In Austria, they were using action learning sets. Again, some of these methodologies are used, I know, in other programs. What is interesting is that some of these initiatives have influenced others around. And changing systems requires relating to the many and not just the few, and it means moving out into the ecosystem. And I think one of these things that has been fundamental about these these programs is how much they have connected people, both within and beyond, but connected to education. We will come back to that. Finally here, and a challenge for us, and I think something quite interesting here that may come up, is the importance of judicious choices around online use, because we certainly found that while it's valuable and timely, and people can have synchronous and asynchronous when they want it, sometimes the depth is not there online, or some of the practical work is more difficult to do online. AI, as you can see, is a theme, and it'll be interesting to see as we move forward the changes. Okay. But really, I think I was perhaps most struck perhaps by this, how in every single case we saw how transformative personal growth requires you to come out really changed in what you were thinking about. And if we go back to the mid-70s, management was talking about activity traps and busy work and so on, unquestioning activity. And it's how do we get there, and how do we create the dissonance? And this is what these programs and associated activities were being disruptive enough, disequilibrating experiences to promote internal conflict, so that the deep learning could occur by curating a range of different experiences within very high levels of safety, the psychological safety and scaffolding, and that's got implications, and as we'll talk about at the end, she'll talk about facilitation through the sorts of examples that you've got there. But if we look at that, it was opening participants up to suspending their ingrained habitual patterns and ways of doing things and assumptions of the way things should work, to ask, who am I as a leader? What's really important to me? Next. And a part of that is the going beyond, is highlighting other perspectives and raising difficult issues such as who's got power and who hasn't got power, and some of the very deliberate strategies in the who's in the room of, even at the beginning, people not knowing other roles of other people in terms of differential power, range of people in the cohort, and really thinking about bringing in some of the cases, bringing in people who are not based in schools, not based in school systems, but are beyond, who are partners or even policy makers, for example, in the Austrian example. And then what's in the room, the range of content, really going beyond not just education, not just management, going beyond very much examples from psychology, philosophy, client-based therapy, and so on, with tools that really help people dig deep, really supporting them to listen, and fundamentally ensuring that important issues, neglected issues, unresolved issues of equity and increasingly of well-being are woven in, and contextualizing this and making sure that place is part of it. And the fourth one, again, you see them all connected, influencing each other with those wiggly lines in between, is the fundamental idea that we have to learn our way forward in a complex environment. Evidence is important, yes, opportunities to practice are important, but it also has to have deep meaning for us and involve the heart, the emotional engagement. And really at the heart of a lot of this is cycles of learning, of inquiry, curiosity, constantly learning, a way of learning leadership for now and for the future. So different kinds of learning, different kinds of practical application that sometimes didn't start until after the so-called program was over. And fundamentally, both learning about telling and sharing one's own story and narrative, but also about hearing stories, sometimes very difficult stories. Indigenous leaders, for example, in New Zealand and in British Columbia, diverse lived experiences, again, modeled with humility, with learning, so that you could see that what you hear and you could really experience it.
Brilliant. So the final slide, so last little bit from us before we move to our panel. So the seventh principle is this adaptive facilitation and modelling. And I'd really draw your attention to how we have presented this in the visual as the thing that holds all of it. And this idea of holding is really important. So it is what holds it all together and enables the things within it. So again, going back to this idea of form follows function, the program and the facilitation, the modeling has to also model that the program doesn't have all the answers and the facilitators don't have all the answers. So again, mirroring these qualities that we're seeking to develop in the leaders themselves around humility, curiosity, how do we handle it when we disagree, encouraging disagreement, and taking the feedback, being able to respond to that and making space, we saw in all these programs, for the participants and their lived experience and their wisdom. So not just being a delivery, here's the content, here are the answers, you need to learn this content and demonstrate to us that you have. But in that last bullet point there, really showcasing and including the wisdom in the room and modelling the fact that we are collectively learning our way together forward. So that doesn't mean there aren't things that we draw on, which is why those cycles of learning that Louise talked about were so important. They're integrating the research and case studies and examples with the lived experience. So a really important thing. So you'll also notice there the fuzzy edge at the edge of the diagram, which is seeking to reflect the fact that we're conscious of this work existing within a dynamic environment, and not that we're not positing some really clear things here, but also acknowledging that that the learning is ongoing, and this is some learning pulled together which integrates into the wider system. So as we pull together our presentation and before the panelists respond, again, like to invite you back into a reflective space. You had your initial reflection on that visual, and we've had a chance to unpack it a little bit and invite you to, again, have a quiet moment of personal reflection. And we're going to open up the chat again. If you would like to share any of that reflection. I've kind of, as you're seeing that visual again from the first impression, having had a time to unpack it, how what's going on for you, what you're noticing, what you're thinking, feeling. We'd be delighted to hear any of those if you wish to share them, but just a moment to digest and process a bit what we've said. Greg, I'm very happy to hand back to you. I'll leave the slide up for a couple more seconds while people are doing the chat, but happy to hand over to you then to start the next part of the session.
Thanks very much, Liz, and we've got some great reflections coming up in the chat. The chat's will shut in a couple of minutes, and then the place for all of you to put your questions, and I'm sure we will have a lot of questions, is through the Q&A box, the Q&A chat, and then we'll put as many of those questions as we can to Louise and Liz and to our panelists in the last 25 minutes or so of the webinar.
Greg, I'm going to be annoying and interrupt you just quickly to say I'm going to stop sharing the slides, but if you want to take a photo of that, just, I mean, participants, in terms of when you're listening to the things, if you want to have a visual record of it, obviously just take a photo, and it's on the paper and the website, but just for ease, and then I'll stop sharing the slides in a second.
That's a good idea. And I think it's obvious, isn't it, how much thought Liz and Louise have put into that visual, which just really conceptualizes and captures so much. We're going to move on to some responses from our panel now. And our first panelist is Valerie Hannon. So Valerie, thinking from a kind of a global perspective, having read the think piece in the research paper and listened to Louise and Liz just now, what for you are the kind of the principles and messages shared by Liz and Louise would you see as most important? Where do you see other green shoots, maybe beyond the examples that Liz and Louise share in their cases in the two papers? What do you see as being maybe supportive of even greater progress in leadership learning?
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Liz. First of all, let me express my appreciation for being invited to make a few comments, because it gives me an opportunity to say how terrific I think this paper is. I really, really welcome it. I think it's fantastically timely, and a whole range of things I'd want to say in support of it, but perhaps I'll pick out, firstly, my appreciation for the fact that the authors have focused on system and systemness and not just individual institutions, and secondly on transformation and not just improvement. These are easy words to say, phenomenally difficult to grasp and to effect, but they bring huge clarity, I think, to this work. They've shone a light on some outliers, and in so doing, I think, revealed a lot of the superficiality, quite frankly, of a lot of existing leadership learning and leadership development, which currently is predominant. But in saying they're outliers, I also want to affirm the choice of your sample, if you like, because I recognize this. These are not alone in international terms by any means. And I can think of two programs running, one in South Australia, one in the state of Victoria in Australia, which share these characteristics. I think of High Tech High and its program in its Graduate School of Education and its network. And I think of Deeper Learning. All of these initiatives, also focused, by the way, on transformation and system, do share these characteristics, but I have never seen them as clearly codified and brought together with such elegant simplicity. So I hugely welcome that, and I thank the authors for it. I shall use it, and I think the agenda that you've set out of trying to impact on how leadership learning evolves is an immensely important one. So I have two observations, I think, maybe two and a half, if I can offer or maybe add some value to this. I'm not sure I can, but I'll try. And I make these observations from my perspective, which personally, I suppose, has three defining characteristics over the last 20 years. Firstly, as co-chair and co-founder of the Global Education Leaders Partnership, NB, not a program, Lou's distinction earlier on. This is a partnership formed in 2009, explicitly focused then on transformation of systems, bringing together system leaders. We've run this partnership program now in 21 countries, involving 16 jurisdictions. And I think we've learned a bit about what is involved in people throwing themselves into the very serious task of system transformation. We only work with system leaders, Now, that might have been institutional leaders who were adopting a system role, but nonetheless, that was their vision. So that was experience one. Experience two is the author of 2 studies recently on leadership for the OECD flagship programs. One, its Education 2040 program, and one, its Education for Human Flourishing, both transformational agendas. And I've written 2 papers there looking at what competencies are needed by such leaders. And the third piece I want to throw in, which is where I'm going to end in a minute, is as the author of a study on the politics of education transformation. All this stuff is noted in the references to the paper, so if you want to follow up, it's there. But that's where I'm coming from, and that's why I say the following 2 things. One, I think that the paper concentrates on the how leadership learning is developed, delivered, whatever verb you want to choose, in a phenomenally comprehensive way. But as a prospectus, an agenda for the big question that you posed at the beginning, we need more clarity about the what. In other words, the curriculum of what these programs are needing, are wanting to do. If the purpose is system and future focused, then we need, I believe, some idea of the competencies that leaders need to have, what they know and can do. And I think what would supplement this work hugely as a kind of sister paper or a sister study, I don't think you can do it all in one necessarily, is to have a focus on those competencies that the programs are seeking to create in participants, as well as how they go about doing it. The closest I think it comes to it was looking at the whole notion of building new narratives. And building new narratives, in my view, is fundamental to the new skill set, the new competency set that transformative system leaders will need. But other things too, and that includes becoming system thinkers. How are leaders enabled to become system thinkers? How are they thinking about learning to be innovation leaders? It's a technical, I mean, there is a knowledge base to this, how to lead and manage, yes, manage innovation itself. So I think that there is a curriculum. I've tried to set it out elsewhere. But for me, this paper would be even more powerful if it was married to, partnered with, not just the how of how programs should be delivered and designed, the 7 principles, but also what is the competency, the set of competencies that we're seeking to promote amongst leaders. Point 1. Point 2. The paper headlines the profound personal shift, the profound personal growth that's needed amongst leaders if we are to address this work. And I couldn't concur more. I think that's absolutely right. But for the most part, we know that change is resisted, that change is politically framed, and the risk of burnout amongst people who struggle in systems which are not structured to support the endeavour is huge. I mean, that is what we're looking at in the country of England at the moment, not everywhere. But here we continue with a system which is not intending to be transformative. It continues to sift and sort young people. It continues with high stakes accountability. It continues with a fundamentally subject-based secondary curriculum. These things hugely constrain what leaders who want transformation to do. And so achieving systemic change requires navigating, I think, significant political and cultural resistance. So I feel that if we look at this paper as freestanding, it kind of overemphasizes the role of the individual mindset, relationships, personal growth, which I'm not, by the way, saying are not important, they're hugely important, but one needs as well to look at the fact that there are structural and political barriers to change. And so that brings us back, in a sense, to competencies, because I would want to add in that we want our leaders to be capable of strategic political negotiation and advocacy, managing conflict, resistance, and political backlash. And I've seen this for 15 years in the Global Leaders Partnership, where one may endeavour to bring about that personal growth and shift. But at the same time, there is a competency, a skill set that's needed, a real knowledge base, a curriculum, if you like, that enable people to address it with efficacy. And I think if we bring the 2 things together, wow, we might just stand a chance.
Thanks very much, Valerie. And I think Liz and Louise, I might put one or two of those points to you after we've heard from Evelyn and from James, just those closing kind of questions. But it would be great now, Evelyn, to hear from you, thinking from a practitioner perspective. How does what you've read and heard ring true, for your experiences? What would your one wish or ask be for policymakers, thinking about Valerie's question related to kind of possible system barriers to the type of leadership learning and leadership itself that we're looking for? How might we support more of this kind of work in the system?
Thank you, Greg. And before I kind of get stuck into my very considered reply, just a thank you to Louise and Liz, really, for firstly acknowledging that we live in a complex, rapidly changing world whereby leadership has got to change. But what that looks like has got to change. And I think that's something that not all policymakers are keeping up with. So I want to thank you for acknowledging that. And Louise, when you were talking about leading with openness, trust, and vulnerability, I think that talks to the heart of leadership for me personally. And I think within that is relationships. And for me, that is the golden thread, actually, that runs through all of this. So a real acknowledgement for that. But obviously, I'm delighted to be on this panel, speaking not just from a practitioner's perspective, but also from a governance perspective. I sit on a number of boards, and I think that they have a role to play if we are to move the dial in what leadership learning actually looks like. So does this piece resonate with me? Deeply, it resonates with me and my experience across, leadership boards, looking at performance management, thinking about system leadership. And I say that because for me, the emphasis that you really focus on in terms of deep personal growth, I think is super important. I think where you talk about adaptive facilitation and networked relationships, going back to that golden thread, I think is so important. We need to do things differently in this complex, rapidly changing world. And my perspective in chairing national panels, supporting senior leaders, I've seen how impactful leadership learning requires more than just a framework, okay? Because it becomes too binary. We're kind of locked into something if we're just using a framework. For me, it demands that reflection, that trust, and that courageous dialogue that we need to have with each other in the system. Personal experience delivering MPQs is a prime example for me how, as a facilitator, sometimes you can lose that personal connection if you're not in the room. And when I talk about the rapidly changing world, I think we need to acknowledge that AI is great and online is great, but that relationship, that face-to-face, I think that develops trust and it helps with that courageous dialogue. So again, the idea that you talk about in terms of interrupting assumptions and activity traps, I think is super powerful. I've worked with leaders who are brilliant at delivery, but they're rarely given the space to pause. They're rarely given the space to pause and reflect and reframe their thinking. And I think that is where real growth really begins to kind of take place. So if I had one ask, it would be to embed leadership learning into structures that shape leadership, not as a bolt-on, but as a baked in, that leadership learning baked in. We're all learning. We never stop learning. We never stop growing, but it's got to be really baked into a system that doesn't feel like an add-on. We need investment in long-term, inquiry-driven development that really reflects the complexity that leaders face. If I think about headship, it's It's one of the best gigs in the world. But it's changed. Headship is a different gig to what it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so we have got to invest in those long-term changes, especially for leaders who are working across diverse communities. And as Valerie mentioned, those high stakes environment, the accountability system, we've got to be cognizant of that. And so when I thought about, well, how could we use this paper? How could we do things differently? And I think number one is around the role that governors have to play. I think that there's room for governors to think about their learning and how are they kind of leading the learning in their trusts and their schools. I think that governing boards must create cultures of reflection and psychological safety. And I say that specifically for many, many marginalised communities. I think that they have got to actively reflect on their own learning and what do their boards actually look like. I think we could use this paper, as has already been mentioned, around cross-sector collaboration. I think we need shared spaces where the educators, policymakers and researchers learn together. I think we should do that, and we say we do this, but I think there's something about gatekeeping. I think there's certain groups that gatekeep the ideas, and we do not let those diverse voices come into the conversation. Who is asking? Who's sitting at the table? And I think that's where we could use this paper to really begin to move the dial. And then I think there's something about the narrative and visibility. I think we must tell the stories of transformative leadership and not just be looking at the matrices. We've got to think about hearts and minds. We've got to think about serving our communities. And I think that we've got to really kind of move away from everything is based on a metric, whether that is Progress Aid, Ofsted, etc. I think we really need to think about the amazing, amazing transformative leadership that is out there that really is about hearts and minds. And so in closing, I think leadership learning should be bold. I think it should be relational, and I think it should be future facing. It's a complex, rapidly changing world, and so we must be future facing. It's not just about what leaders know, but really it is about how they grow. And for me, that's a shift, and that's where the magic will start to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. So our last panelist response is going to come from James Pope. So James, how does all of this relate to your work with school leaders at scale? What are you hearing from school leaders about what they need and what they're experiencing that might connect to some of these principles or messages from Liz and Louise's study?
Brilliant. Thanks, Greg. And similarly, just to extend thanks to Louise and Liz for doing this piece of work. It very much resonates with the Heads Up for Head Teachers Network and the work that we do and what we see in that work that we do. But I'd also like to extend thanks to the 5 programs, not programs, who volunteered to be part of the study, because I think that's they are hopefully representative of a lot of other programs, as Valerie has hinted at, that are also working or trying to work in this very different way. And Valerie, just to reflect on one of your reflections about the sister piece, I think you called it, but a shout out. I think Liz is also leading alongside Sean McInerney, who's on the call, something called Rethinking Leadership, which is doing that piece about sort of codifying characteristics that we might want to see developed. So would love to invite you along to that at some point. I'm sure that would be a good space for you to be in, Valerie. Yeah, Greg, I mean, I think what's interesting is is just how much this really resonates with what we are seeing in the Heads Up for Head Teachers Network. And I suppose, we're trying to work intentionally on well-being support. So it very much falls into that notion of personal growth and seeing well-being as part of as part of this piece of research as something which is considered as part of and baked in, as Evelyn put it, rather than afterwards or after the event. So when we talk about intentionality, we talk about intentionality of looking after our leaders, rather than operating in a system and in a culture where we wait for them to break and then think about maybe giving them some support. So intentionality is a big part of what we do. But then our second design principle is this notion of sustainability. So, how can we create sustainable well-being support, peer support networks, self-sustaining peer support networks? And I think it is interesting that the word sustainability is in our work. It comes up in this study. It also comes up in, I'm not Toby Greeny, as if anybody who was expecting Toby Greeny to be here, but it is also, the title of the paper that the University of Nottingham have just recently launched is this notion of sustainable school leadership. What factors do we need to see in the system to enable that to happen? So, I think increasingly we're getting a sense of the importance of sustainability. I think the things that resonated in terms of, I guess, the practice is the thing about network. I mean, the thing about personal growth really comes through clearly and strongly. And I do love that sort of yin and yang sort of resonance and relationship at the heart of the model between sort of, if we're going to get sort of system approaches, system transformation, then actually we also need to be taking care of self, and we also need to be learners in our own space. And that is really important in the work that we do. One of the things that we talk about is actually if we're not looking after ourselves, we're trapped in the here and now all of the time, then actually we can't find any capacity to think about transformation even in the medium term is often very challenging for school leaders in our network. But the point I guess I want to sort of really focus on is this notion of sort of psychologically safe networks, and it came through in the chat actually earlier on, just how much that was really resonating with people, the relational aspects of leadership and being a leader, and how really effective networks can sustain that. But actually, interestingly, what we see in the system is in England in particular, but we have seen it elsewhere. What we often see is networks that are not psychologically safe and are therefore compounding the problem. So one of the activities that we do with our leaders is we get them to do a network analysis. And that is countering one of the 5 issues that our leaders talk about, is this notion of being isolated, which can sound very strange for anybody outside of education. Like, you work in a school, you're surrounded by people every single day. How can you possibly be isolated? But this sense, 97% of our network respondents talk about this feeling of isolation that comes with the decision-making authority. And so we're trying to address that, and we do that through a network mapping exercise. What's interesting about when our network do that network mapping exercise in their own network is often that the network is filled and indeed overflowing with individuals and organizations within their sort of domain specific experience, which are focused on the technical and the managerial and the here and the now. So they're almost trapped by their own network in the here and the now, and there is no space for them to get out of that network. So I think the way in which these 5 programs, not programs, have managed to create psychologically safe networks, which create spaces in which people can think beyond the here and the now and the technical and the managerial aspects of their role, I think is really, really important, because I think that what we see is a lot of transactional relationships. We see a lot of one-way relationships, and the 2 things that are missing all the time in those network evaluations is this notion of being nourished, and part of that nourishment is actually the provocation, the creative curiosity that we might have about the way things are and the way we might want things to be in the future. And that notion of nourishment is nearly always missing for school leaders, beyond perhaps one conference a year that they might have the opportunity to get to. So I think that that notion of nourishment as both a thing that is important in itself, but is also important for well-being and creating really good systems of well-being. I think I was really interested in what we see missing perhaps sometimes in the system is a focus on self, putting everybody else first. So our own professional learning, our own professional development, however we want to encapsulate that, being left to the thing that happens last. And the culture in the system sort of almost encouraging that actually, well, you've got your MPQH certificate if you're in the English education system, well, you've got your head teacher qualification if you are elsewhere. That's your professional learning commitment filled. And what I love about this program is the fact that it is encouraging this notion of actually our personal learning, our professional learning, our leadership learning is a lifelong commitment. It is not something that we tick a box on and say, that's it, we are done. So I think that's really interesting to notice, and that's something we see in our own network. And this notion of I was interested in the relationship between the future-focused transformation and the activity traps. So the culture certainly that we see in England around silver bullet solutions, the unintended consequences of best practice networks. This is the way to do it, which creates this locked solution focused. We've got the solution. Do you want the solution? Without there being any encouragement to get into the sort of design principles of how that solution evolved, how it came about, why that solution works within its context. So I think that the relationship between being sort of system focused and future focused in a transformational sense, and the way that the activity traps and the sheer weight of the work that is required of school leaders is keeping them locked in a space where they just cannot get the capacity to do that kind of work. So those are the things that really resonated with me. I mean, I think again, Valerie, I thought your point about the responsibility of the sort of governments to create the conditions in which programs, not programs such as these, can flourish, I think is really, really important. And I certainly think that, you know, we see this as an individual level, but in this way, in a sort of programmatic level, is that how the green shoots can die because the conditions in which they're being grown are not right. And I think that notion of, Liz, you made the point, we are the system. And I think that's really important, that as a system, we are encouraging this flourishing transformational approach to school leadership and school leader development, so that we can actually, as the green shoots grow into plants and they start to, you know, if they're starting to drop leaves, then actually that starts to enrich the soil around us. So we create this beautiful cycle as that we would see in nature, of those green shoots being enabled to flourish. Yes, the governments have a responsibility to enable that to happen, but actually that it then becomes a self-sustaining, culture as well as a self-sustaining system and program and leadership learning. So those are the things that really resonated with me. I hope they are useful reflections, but I really look forward. By the number of people on this call, I think it's really important that, you know, hopefully we're going to see some impact, and we're going to see this work move on and move our approaches to leadership learning on, not just in England, but beyond in international settings as well.
Thanks so much, James. We're gonna move in a minute to your questions you've all been putting to us through the Q&A function. But I did want to just pick up on one of the challenges that Valerie raised in her response, and maybe put it to you first, Louise, and then Liz, you might want to respond as well. And it's the challenge that from Valerie's perspective, you know, this paper focuses on the how, and we maybe need a bit more clarity around the what, the curriculum, the competencies that you would see as being important in the kind of leadership learning that you're looking for.
Well, I'll just start with a little bit more. I'm going to go the what of the curriculum, because just to be clear, some of this is mentioned in the paper, and it's certainly mentioned in reports, that in terms of trying to do this, there was a real focus in different ways in the different programs on issues such as systemic change, a future focused curriculum. So the sorts of elements that fit with this, and in terms of the were you talking about courage, and it's come through the need to be bold and the courage and the authenticity. A lot of that came through in the how, but also in modules, sometimes in modules and sometimes in the ways of working. So I completely agree with you. The content is really important. It wasn't identical in all of them, and some of them were fit to different times. And I should say, just weaving in some of the political elements, the Austrian case study, which is an older one but was going for a very long time, is particularly interesting because its mantra in a way was working in and on the system. And the idea was, we are in a particular system. It was supported by the Minister of Education at the time, but the idea was that we need to be able to do the things we need to be able to do. I think, Liz, you could say this is probably true of the big leadership adventure that was. So there are particular elements, but in relation to some of the other points that have just been made there, and even possibly some of the questions, who was in the room having policymakers, having higher education, having regional leaders as well as school leaders in the room in the Austrian case study made it that much easier to bring about change, because people were talking with each other and moving forward. Liz, over to you.
Well, just as James sort of gave a shout out for that, alongside this, and I've put it in the chat, we've got this group called Rethinking Leadership, which is an open group, and everyone on this call would be warmly welcome to join it. Many people involved are. We're doing precisely that piece of work, Valerie. So really digging down into what is it we need these leaders to be like. And I think the two pieces do go. Have we misunderstood?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. This paper really focuses on what should they be like: bold, courageous, personal growth, terribly important, which is different from what should they know and be able to do in terms of their competencies. And I think that's the missing part if you are genuinely looking to be transformational. So can these leaders learn in these programs to lead and manage innovation? Can they be system thinkers? Can they be advocates in a much broader sense than sitting in the same room with policymakers for a different vision of what education can be, which connects with policymakers, with politicians, and with their communities, particularly their communities? This is a set of competencies. By the way, competencies, I'm using the technical sense of knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes, the bucket of all four. And so it's not about what kind of person am I, it's what do I know, as well as what do I know and what can I do to bring about these transformational changes, which have the characteristics you've said. So I do think it's an important distinction, but I don't want to belabor it, and I don't want it to detract from the huge strengths of this paper, because I think it's enormously strength. But I think it's a complementary set of inquiries, which, by the way, OECD is pursuing in a whole range of countries, which in my experience, as I've said, since 2009, with people trying to do this in their jurisdictions across every continent, have found really challenging, really problematic.
And I would just say that I can certainly think of one or two of the programs and initiatives that are doing those kinds of things as well.
Of course,
yeah,
of course. So I'm saying, Louise, to kind of codify that, which do exist in the I know they do. Your emphasis has been on the how is it delivered? What kind of people are we trying to create? But I know that the programs also say, well, we need to have a cognitive dimension to this. And what does that look like? And kind of extracting from both your sample and beyond what we really think are the new competencies, not just those which NPQL, which were fundamentally technocratic, managerial. We're going beyond that, you know.
I think we should move to questions from our audience, just to make sure we've got at least 15 minutes. We've got some great questions, and it's an international audience. I'd like to share a question from Anna Jalonc in Catalonia. And Anna's question is, in times of political instability and uncertainty, How can educational leaders and partners build and sustain trust, especially when government's priorities are always changing or might change? And so what does it take to maintain consistent values-driven leadership and leadership development in these kinds of shifting contexts? And maybe I'll put that to you first, Liz.
That's a great question. What does it take to build trust in relationships? I mean, building trust, as Valerie's saying, alluding to, this is a technical thing, it's a technique to building trust. And you go back to Carl Rogers, we teach people how to do that on our programs. It's about appropriate reciprocal self-disclosure. So it's about being human, it's about being relational, it's about how you build trust. There's also an element of expertise that builds trust. So being competent also builds trust, that people feel safe. Psychological safety is a part of that. So showing up authentically as human beings is part of how you build trust. Being competent and helping people solve problems is part of how you build trust. And sticking around is part of how you build trust. Time is significant, and it might not be that you are the person, but continuity of known adults or known safe people in a place, particularly in very underserved communities, is really, really important. People don't trust when they when they feel blocked or they feel marginalized or not welcome. So the whole theme around kind of the diversity, the sense of belonging is all part of that. And I mean, Evelyn may want to come in on that theme, more of that, because in some communities we know it's more difficult to build trust than others. And so how we show up and how we acknowledge and make space for the trauma, the distress that people may be experiencing is part of that, and being able to handle that productively.
I think,
sorry, Evelyn, I took over chair duties, invited.
Oh no, I was going to say something very quickly because conscious of time. But I think there's two things I'd add to that, Liz. I think there's something about showing humility. I think as leaders, I think it's super important. People will trust you more when you can show that level of humility, as opposed to always blagging it. And I think there are some leaders who do blag, and I'm all about humility. And I think about the notion of belonging. I think what our communities need, what our children need, what the adults need in the system is to be listened to. And James, you used a word that really resonates with me, which is about intentionality. So we can all listen, but are we listening to or listening for? Okay. And it's really, really wanting to listen quite deeply. And I think humility and that openness to listen, I think, is another way to build trust and drives a sense of belonging.
Thank you, Evelyn. I'd like to move on to another question. I think quite a lot of people in the webinar will be thinking practically about the design, or might be involved yourselves in the design of professional learning, leadership learning. And we have I think quite an interesting question from Claudine Manache-Jones in Madrid. And Claudine's question is, what were the common mistakes that you saw course designers and delivery teams making or having made in trying to live up to the kind of the principles that you outline in your study? And Claudine, I sort of add, thank you for this great work. But maybe I'll put that question to you first, Louise, and then over to you, Liz, if you want to add to that.
Of course, the principle. It may be that I'm not understanding how the wording of the question. The principles weren't there initially. I would say. Certainly others do this, but I think sometimes it was not. It's possibly not having a completely clear theory of change, because a theory of change is not something fixed. It's something that evolves. It is about a curiosity mindset, and therefore if if you don't approach this with we are learning our way forward, and I think they did, but what is it exactly? And I think in some ways Valerie's pushing us to be sort of clearer on that. What are we learning our way forward to? It's very hard to see if you have achieved that. And so we were in evaluation. I was looking at different things and pulling things together in different ways. It's such a brilliant question, and I think I'd like to think about that some more. Liz,
Yeah.
what some and I'd like to think about it more and maybe write something else about it. Liz, have you what were some things, some mistakes that you think you made?
I mean, I
Or
think
more maybe mistakes that you saw or you heard about from program
yeah,
designers.
definitely. And I think you know, as Lou said, like trying to evaluate our program was like evaluating a moving bus, because we were adapting all the time. We were modeling that adaptation, which meant we learned quickly from our mistakes. I think one of the classic things is cognitive load and just how much, you know, there's never enough time because there's so much stuff. So I think that is a kind of classic mistake of trying to do too much and not giving enough time to the relationship building, the creating of psychological safety. I think so, you know, that's a big thing I think happens across the piece. How do you go deep, carve out enough time and hold your nerve on how much of percentage of the time it takes to do that, that then you can go quickly on the other stuff. So yeah, I'm conscious of time. So I think that's a classic mistake I see people grappling with.
Thanks, Liz. We have a question from Mark, who's interested in the problem or the challenge of scale, and that it is a challenge, isn't it? If we're thinking about transformative change, think about how we can do that at scale. So Mark's question is, you know, how can you move from program level to system level with the kind of principles that you've drawn out in your study? What do you see as the optimum scope for or scale for effective implementation of your ideas? Is it possible to be too grand in scale? Might scale sometimes be an obstacle for the realization of the kind of principles that you outline? Maybe we'll start with Liz this time.
Yeah, thanks. It made me think of Evelyn's point about governance, actually, because really this goes to politics. So the really upstream answer to this that I've been kind of down an intellectual rabbit hole with is the sort of work that's been coming out of Demos and others around going beyond new public management approaches to policy making. So kind of public service reform, and how does policy get made? Because ultimately, so long as you've got short-term political cycles driving policy, you know, it's very difficult for anyone in those top decisions to have enough psychological safety, to the point you're making, even at a local level about governance, to actually be reflective and be open and be vulnerable and say, oh, we got that, didn't get that right, how do we learn our way forwards? That is not what our political system demands or models in any way, shape or form. So, you know, we're stuck in this kind of reactive short-term cycle at a political level. So that doesn't make me despondent, or sometimes it does, but, you know, I try not to be despondent about that. And that's where the kind of, as James, you know, reinforcing that we are the system. It's like, well, where can we make the change and be different? And, you know, spreading that at scale is possible. I think it's an interesting question that I grapple with all the time about, well, where's that change coming from? Because it ain't going to come from the top, is my sense. So it's for us in the system to, I mean, maybe unless you go and live in another country, Valerie's looks despondent, I thought, but in this country, in this moment in time with our politics, I don't see how it's coming from the top.
I'd just like to reiterate one point, and others may want to come in on this. I think we shouldn't underestimate the associated activities part. And I'm thinking at the moment, and there were other cases, but I'm thinking at the moment of the British Columbia case, transformative educational leadership program, which is one of a number of, let's call them initiatives. That doesn't feel the right word. That its originators, Judy Holbert and Linda Kayser, who are actually on the call in the morning in British Columbia, they are, and they really are plugging people in from different points in different places. So they have got networks of Indigenous and innovative education. They have other elements, and people are sort of moving backwards and forwards and connected in these. So this is partly about tentacles in that. And you might argue that in British Columbia, which is a province rather than a country, but it has its own education, you might say that the policymakers are more open and the politicians are more open to this. But I think there are elements of that in scale as well until it becomes irresistible.
Thanks, Louise. I think we probably have time just for one more question. And we have a member of the audience who I think must be working in higher education, and they're interested in what connections you see to higher education and higher education leadership in the work that you've been doing, where you see it being relevant, how it might apply. Maybe I'll go to you first on this, Louise.
I think higher education is really important, and I think if we come back to the very beginning of the session and this particular centre, which is a centre which bridges research and practice, I know in some countries there is very little connection between researchers and practitioners other than people doing master's degrees in leadership through universities. And I think the importance of higher education working closely with practitioners, I think this gets to the methodology of people working together to design new methodologies, and there are some out there, and to participate together is a really critical piece of this.
Thank you very much, Louise. And I think we're probably at the time just to say some thank yous. First of all, really a big thank you to our panel, to Valerie, James, and Evelyn, and a huge thank you to you, Liz, and Louise. I think it's been a fantastic 90 minutes, and also your kind of pracademic partnership, I think, has a unique edge in terms of what you've been able to bring, and I think that's partly why you've been able to codify this thinking so sharply, as Valerie said, and you know, Liz, bringing so much credibility to this as having actually put these principles into practice in your own setting and in the system, and Louise, you know, having spent so much of your professional academic career thinking about these questions. You know, Louise talked about our Centre for Educational Leadership as providing a bridge between research and practice, but Louise, you've really been absolutely central for us in terms of constructing that bridge, and we're always so grateful for your professional generosity and everything that you've given us in our centre over the years, and continue to give as well. And thanks so much to all of you for attending as well. It's fantastic to have had around 150 colleagues joining at the end of the day on a Wednesday. I think it probably speaks to your passion for the kind of the themes and questions and challenges that we've been exploring. So thanks very much, everybody. And I'm sure it's a conversation that you'll be continuing in your own settings and within your own networks.